All right, so I was texted this morning by someone, and they were asking me about a more visual explanation of the TR position. Now, I'm not going to give a super visual presentation. I'm going to try to do like a compromise here, since I just don't have video editing abilities. But I was asked to explain the TR position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the TR position. I'm probably going to disable comments on this just because I'm not really interested in arguing or debating about the TR position. But I just want to help people to understand kind of what the TR position is. So the TR stands for Textus Receptus. And Textus Receptus comes from Latin, and it means receive text. Okay? So, in order to explain this, let's go back. So, when the Apostle Paul first wrote the Bible under inspiration, or any writer, okay, that first piece of paper that he would have wrote on is what is called an autograph. An autograph in Greek basically means like self writing. Okay, so it's the first writing, it's the original. Okay, and so let's say when Paul wrote, let's just say he wrote it. Let's just say his letter to Ephesians. Okay, which I think Ephesians was also sent to the Thessalonians, but there would be copies that would be made, and these are called. Technically, the term is opograph, or we would say manuscripts, and sometimes that is shortened to MSS. These are manuscripts, okay? And of course, these would be copied, these would be copied, these would be copied, okay? Until you fast forward to say the printing press was let's just Google here and see when was the printing press invented. Okay, so the printing press, as you can see, it was written in around 1436, okay? So from the time the Bible was written until 1436, okay, all you had was manuscripts, and of course you would have ancient translations. Okay, so there's like Latin, Syriac. There would be Greek translations of the Old Testament, which we call the Septuagint. LXX means 70, and it comes from a myth relating to the creation of the Septuagint. And whenever people use the word Septuagint, they just refer to ancient Greek translations of the Old Testament. But there's all other things like that. Other evidences we have are early church fathers, which some people shorten to ECF, early church fathers. So early influential people in Christianity, they would write and they would quote from the scriptures, and we have some of their writings. Some of them would write books, and those are all testimonies to what the original scriptures were. Okay, so let's see. So in 1516, there's a man named Erasmus. His first name is Desiderius. Desiderius Erasmus. He is the one who published the first printed Greek New Testament. He published the first printed Greek New Testament, and most people will say he had a small number of manuscripts. I don't know if it's like 6 or 8 manuscripts that they claim. This is a claim. They claim that it was based on, but Erasmus traveled a lot. He went and looked at a lot of different manuscripts, right? And Erasmus published his first Greek New Testament, 1516, which you can see is sometime shortly after the printing press. Before that, it was all just hand-copied manuscripts. And hand-copied manuscripts made from things like papyrus, things made from vellum, which would be like animal skins, things like that. And so Erasmus published his first edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516 in Basel. He also published an edition in 1519, which Martin Luther used that text as his translation into German. Erasmus also published editions in 1522, 1527, 1535, etc., etc. Now, there was also an edition of the New Testament published in something called the Complutensian Polyglot. The Complutensian Polyglot. And I won't go into. You can look this up later. There was another printer. His name was Simon Colinaeus, and he published in 1534. He published an edition that was based on one of Erasmus's editions and on one of the Polyglot editions. Okay. And then his son is, you probably maybe not heard of him, but his name was Robert Estienne, or sometimes you'll see it as Stephanus. I think Estienne might have been the Latin name, and Stephanus would be more Greek. Now, Robert Stephanus, it's important to realize that he was Reformed. Okay? Now, Erasmus was technically, he was a Catholic priest. And but he did write a lot of stuff criticizing practices in the Catholic Church. Erasmus was kind of an oddball. They say that Erasmus laid the egg for the Reformation and Martin Luther hatched it. Okay? So, Robert Estienne, or Robert Stephanus, he was Reformed. He was a reformer. And he published editions of the Greek New Testament based on Erasmus, building on Erasmus's work in Paris. And he published editions in 1546, 1549, 1550, 1551, etc., etc. Then there's a guy named Theodore Beza. Theodore Beza in Geneva. And Theodore Beza, he was a French Protestant. Okay? And Theodore Beza, a French Protestant, he published editions of the Greek New Testament based, I believe he was building on the Stephen's text, Robert Stephanus text, in 1565, 1582, 1588, 1598, and the edition of Beza in 1589 and the last edition of Stephanus. These are the editions that mainly were used by the King James Version translators. Okay? Now, there were also some people, they're called the Elsevier Brothers. We're almost done with this section. The Elsevier Brothers. And they published Greek editions of the New Testament in 1624, 1633, forgive my handwriting, in 1641. And they followed Beza's 1564 edition. Okay? Now, in the preface to the 1633 Elsevier edition, there was a preface, and it said in Latin that it was the textum ergo habis nunc ab omnibus receptum, which, if I'm remembering it correctly, essentially what that translates into English as you have here the text received by all. Okay, so all these different editions, okay, of Erasmus, of Simon Colinaeus, of the Complutensian Polyglot, of Robert Stevens' editions, of Beza's editions, of the Elsevier editions, they're known as the TR, or the Textus Receptus, because this was the Greek text that were received by the Protestant churches. The Textus Receptus formed the basis. Any one of these editions of the TR formed the basis for all of the Protestant Reformation era Bibles. So, like the Reina Valera was the Spanish Bible. You have the Dutch Statenvertaling. There's others, like I think the French Oosterwald text. Pretty much all the Protestant Reformation translations from that time period were based on the Textus Receptus. Now, it's important to note that the editions of Stephanus and Beza and Elsevier, they present substantially the same text. There are some extremely minor variations. The variations rarely affect the sense. There are some of them, okay? So, I'm a TR guy, and what I believe is any edition of the TR is substantially superior to any of the modern editions of the Greek TR, which would be published by like the United Bible Society. Sometimes you see that in the Nestle Aland text, Tyndale. I don't know if I'll get into the different theories of the critical text. We might get into an introduction, maybe eventually I'll do a video on this. But if you press me for an edition of the TR, I'd probably go with Beza's 1598 or whatever. Now, Scrivener published an edition, I want to say, well, let me just look here. The Scrivener TR was published, it looks like 1881. And Scrivener's text, he was trying to represent the critical, well, the King James is not 100% based on any specific TR edition. So with the King James, Scrivener was trying to reproduce what would have been the Greek textual choices that the King James translators went with, okay? So this edition is largely, it's very much available. And so I would say either any of these editions of the TR are vastly superior, okay? Now, there's different titles. My son is here. You can hear him wandering around behind me. There are different titles that TR defenders will go by. Okay, so I prefer the term received text. And so basically that the received text, the TR, is the text that was received by the Bible-believing church around the time of the advent of the printing press, which I think is somewhat significant. Some people, like there's a guy named Robert Truelove is alive today. He calls it the canonical approach. So with the canon, if you were to read Protestant articles today on the canon of Scripture, like why don't we accept the Protestant or the Catholic Bible books with the Apocrypha, which had things like Maccabees and Bell and the Dragon and other things. It's funny because when you read articles on it, a lot of times what they'll say is, well, the Protestant church and the churches historically did not, they'll use the word receive the apocryphal books of Scripture. And it's really interesting because if you read a book by a modern evangelical today, a lot of the arguments that they'll put forth for why they don't accept the Apocrypha will sound a lot like TR people. So with the canonical approach, they would say just like the Spirit of God led believers throughout history to receive the books of the Bible, Robert Truelove would take it a step further and say that during the Protestant Reformation era, the Spirit of God was working through people like Erasmus, and everybody dogs on Erasmus because Erasmus was a Catholic. But you got to remember that Erasmus laid the groundwork, and that work was edited by Protestants like Stephanus and Beza, and I don't know what the Elsevier Brothers were, but and then that text was received by Protestants. Hence why there were all the Protestant Bible translations that were done in it. Okay, so Robert Schuller would take it a step further. He would call it the Canonical Approach, and it's really interesting because like Vaticanus, if you're familiar at all with New Testament, this debate on textual criticism, Vaticanus people, a lot of people like Westcott and Hort, and they viewed Vaticanus as it's an old manuscript of the New Testament. But what a lot of people don't know is Vaticanus has an Old Testament in Greek, and Vaticanus Old Testament in Greek has the Apocrypha, and I believe it has the Apocrypha in the text, not like in a separate section. So it's interesting how there's a lot of readings in the critical editions, like in these critical editions of the Nestle Aland and the United Bible Societies. There's a lot of readings in this that get support from Vaticanus, but a lot of evangelicals, they don't accept the Apocrypha, even though the Apocrypha is in Vaticanus. And one of the issues with the modern critical textual method, which, today's scholars, they're trying to reproduce or reconstruct the New Testament. And the problem is it's a very empiricist point of view. It's very naturalistic, very humanistic. And everything is based on evidence and what's our evidence and there are, and Jeff Riddle, I'm going to talk about Jeff Riddle, talks a lot about the limitations to this. And there's a debate between James White and Jeff Riddle, and James White's like, well, why don't you treat the New Testament like any other book? You have to apply the same standards that you would to any other book. And Jeff Riddle's response was, but the New Testament isn't like any book. It's sacred scripture. And so this will go into, there's another viewpoint. It's called confessional bibliology. Confessional bibliology people, they defend the TR. Now, I'm not a confessional I don't like this title. I don't accept this term, but I find them to be allies because the confessional bibliology position is based on what's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. And if you look on my computer screen here, this is the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is from Ligon here. The Westminster Confession of Faith, I don't know if it's like 1689 it was published, but if you look here, the Westminster Confession of Faith, I believe there's some Calvinism in this. I haven't read the entirety. I'm pretty sure there are things in it I wouldn't agree with. I'm not Reformed. I'm not Calvinist, okay? And the Westminster Confession of Faith, you can see here, it says, quote, the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of writing of it was most generally known in the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence kept pure in all ages, are therefore authentical. So the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was put out by Protestant Reformation people, and it was put out by what they call them the Westminster Divines, they believed that God inspired the scriptures and by his singular care and providence kept it pure in all ages. So there's a book here. It's called Has the Bible Been Kept Pure? The Westminster Confession of Faith and the Providential Preservation of Scripture. And Garnet Milne goes through the writings of the Westminster Divines to show what they would have meant in this confession by this phrase that it was by his singular care and providence kept pure in all ages. And so they believe, the confessional bibliology people believe, that the TR is the text family, that God has, by singular care and providence, kept these texts pure in all ages. And there's a group out there, it's called the Confessional Bibliology Group. I I don't like everybody in this group. A couple of them are particularly uncharitable, particularly nasty. I find some of their stuff lacking. I really like this guy, Jeff Riddle. Jeff Riddle, in my opinion, is the person today who is writing and putting out information that I would most agree with, even though he would probably call himself a confessional bibliologist. He's very sound. He's very reasonable. He's done debates with James White, which I'll link those to. He's done lectures here. These lectures are a pretty good starting point for the, like, what I would call received text position, which they might call confessional bibliology. He has a podcast called the Word Magazine Podcast and things like that, and I'll mention it. Now, there's some honorable mentions. There was a guy named Dean Burgon. In 1881, wrote a book called Revision Revised. 1881, and he was a critical of Westcott and Hort. Westcott and Hort, which they put out a Greek text in 1881, and theirs was the first majorly accepted Greek text that departed from the TR in many different places. Now, Dean Burgon believed in what he called the traditional text. Now, Dean Burgon was not King James only. He believed the TR needed minor revision, but he definitely would not be accepting of today's Nestle-Allen text or the UBS text or the Tyndale. He would probably be closer to that, to TR. Now, there's another guy. These are just general views. There's another guy. His name's Theodore Letis. Theodore Letis. He called his position the ecclesiastical text. Now, in Matthew 28, Jesus told his disciples to go and teach all nations. And I believe Letis would have been of the opinion that these scriptures were entrusted to the church. And so he would say that you have to look at what the church used, which we would say that's the received text. So there's all these different monikers that this position can go by. Of course, Burgon, with his traditional text, would not have exactly been TR defenders. Okay, so I want to give one honorable mention. David Cloud wrote a book, and I don't agree with everything David Cloud wrote. I don't writes and believes. I don't agree with even everything that he has in this book, but it's called For Love of the Bible. And the one thing in For Love of the Bible that I want to particularly endorse is his history of the development of what we call the critical text, and especially during 1881 with Westcott and Hort's text. He does a really good job of showing, even going back to the 1700s, which people like with people like Tischendorf and Tregelles, showing what a lot of people believed, and showing the popular German rationalism and theological modernism that was going on, and how these things may or may have impacted the textual critical world. And so David Cloud's book For Love of the Bible, and again, I don't endorse everything in it, but the history on the development of what laid the groundwork for today's Nestle-Allen text, and particularly with the Westcott and Hort, that his stuff right there is very, very good, very, very well researched, and of course, I don't really accept it. And there's other positions on the Greek New Testament, which are called the majority text. Now, it's very important to realize that a lot of people will talk about the TR, and they'll talk about the TR as if the TR represents the majority of Byzantine or majority of Greek manuscripts. And it's just not true, because in the TR, and even Jeff Riddle will admit that there are some readings in the TR that have minority Greek manuscript support, but which will have some Latin. manuscript support or early church fathers. For example, 1 John 5:7. You may have heard of the I'm not going to write it out, but the Coma Yohanim, which I did a response to James White has talking points on the comma in 1 John 5:7 of why he doesn't believe it exists. And I will actually link that video probably right here. I just am looking to get a time here on my recording. I don't see. So that would be about 25:43. But anyway, but there's a majority text position. There's a text that was published by Hodges in Farstad in, I want to say, the late 90s. And there was another thing. It's called the Byzantine Text by Robinson Pierpont. I believe that was published in 2008. And Hodges and Farstad was like kind of looking at the majority of Greek manuscripts and trying to come to a consensus, but it wasn't really based on the majority of Greek manuscripts. And David Cloud has an article on, or he wrote, I can't find this article, but where it's not, it says it's a majority manuscript, but it's not even really. And then there's the Byzantine family is based on what's called, or the Byzantine text based on the Byzantine family, which I'm not really sure I subscribe to this idea of families. So it's very popular for especially people who come from a Ruckmanite perspective. And in 1881, Westcott and Hort produced a text that had a lot of minority readings in their text. And there are a lot of they went against the majority of Greek manuscripts in a lot of places. And it's my understanding that Westcott and Hort came up with a theory that in the early, I want to say in the 400s AD, that in the Byzantine Greek Empire, that there was, they call it a Lucian recension. And basically what they believe was there was a major revision done of the Greek manuscripts, and that this revision gained dominance. I'm sorry, you can't even read that. Gained dominance. And so they were trying to explain why the majority of Greek manuscripts had great agreement and harmony. And so they came up with this theory of Byzantine manuscripts, which Ruckmanites will call Antioch manuscripts, and that then there was a Alexandrian. Some people will say there was a Western text type or Caesarean text type. Now, and it's interesting, and people will try to give like these three categories. And a lot of King James only people will say, yeah, the King James is based on the Byzantine and it has the majority. But we already talked about how there are minority readings in the TR. And what's interesting is people will say Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are part of this, but Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are very different from each other. Vaticanus is not the same as Sinaiticus. So this idea of text families was largely popularized by Westcott and Hort. And I think this distinction is largely artificial. I think it's artificial. And so I'm not a proponent really of the Byzantine family text or the Byzantine text. I think the Byzantine text I do think it's largely superior to the critical text. And so this is kind of an overview of the TR position, which is essentially that the TR is the text that was received by believers during the Protestant Reformation. God promised to preserve his word. I believe that God received believers. I believe God was providentially working so that around the time of the printing press that God would have a stable text that's been kept pure. And the problem with today's Greek text is it's always changing. If you were to listen to modern textual Greek, a lot of the people like, I want to say, I don't know if it's Metzger or Bart Ehrman, which Bart Ehrman is not even a Christian anymore, even though he was trained in evangelical seminary. A lot of people believe that it's, a lot of people in the textual critical world believe we'll never know exactly what was in the New Testament. And they're trying to reconstruct, and they believe we're just trying to do to the best of our ability. And if you listen, there's God's providential working and preservation. It's not appealed to a lot. It's not mentioned a lot. So this would be just kind of an overview of the TR. So to my friend who asked me, this was my attempt at trying to give you a visual explanation. Hope it's helpful. Thank you.